Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian, and today's episode is one of these episodes that I am so excited to record because after my top 16 run with this commander, I've gotten so many questions about this deck, and it's probably the deck that I have had the most fun brewing in I can't tell you how long. One of my new favorite decks, definitely, period, for cEDH. It's a weird one, it's a quirky one. You win with very atypical win conditions. Let's talk about my quirky little starfish friend, Plagon, Lord of the Beach. Before we go any farther into this deck tech, make sure while you're here on YouTube, if you like videos like this, if you want to see me continue to experiment with cool, unique, interesting commanders, make sure to hit that like button, that subscribe button. It helps support this channel. And if you want to go even farther, if you want to have one of your decks featured on this channel, go over to patreon.com/comedianmtg. It helps out the channel a ton. So Plagon is a starfish wizard.
The inner machinations of my mind are an enigma.
For 2 and a blue, and this is actually an Azorius commander, because if you check that activated ability right about here, that is an Azorius hybrid ability. So blue-white commander here for the cEDH deck tech. And for 2 and a blue, you get a 0/3 that when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card for each creature you control, including itself, with toughness greater than its power. And then it has an activated ability that I will give you a hint. In my tournament run, I have never activated this ability, but for a blue-white hybrid mana, you can give target creature you control the ability to assign its combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. So as you can tell, the top half of this commander, as I mentioned, is the relevant part of this commander. What do we even do with this commander, right? So clearly the enter the battlefield ability is where this deck focuses, right? So one of the things that I was interested in when I first saw this commander was, how do we best break this ability, right? To me, I was like, okay, I think we have a high enough density of good creatures, right, that have greater toughness than power. That was the appeal for me of this archetype. It was not the fact that necessarily this ability is inherently so insane. We have things that definitely enter and draw cards and all that kind of stuff, but specifically the restriction of only having greater toughness than power didn't remove a number of really efficient, powerful, strong creatures in these colors, right? So we can check this deck out, and obviously we're going to have some creatures in this deck that are not, what I would consider the best of the best, right? For example, we are playing all 3 of the 0 drops in these colors that have greater toughness than power, with being Shield Sphere, Phyrexian Walker, and Ornithopter, right? These are imperative to the deck list, and I don't know that I would ever cut them, because basically the way this deck plays out, and something we will talk about as we go further down into this video, is the deck is a mid-range control deck that pivots into a storm deck, right? It reminds me a lot of the way that you would potentially think about Nadu back in the day. Now, I really want to be clear. This deck is not nearly as strong as Nadu was. Nadu was a commander that was fundamentally broken in almost every single way, right? This deck is good, but it's not Nadu. But the play pattern is very similar in the sense that Nadu, you would sort of play like the best pilots would often be playing more of a tempo control style thing, and then they would land their equipment, and then it would turn into this Nadu storm thing. And that's kind of how this commander works a little bit as well. Not explicitly, but it definitely helps to sort of draw that analog for any pilots familiar with that archetype, right? So back to this idea of good creatures with higher toughness than power, right? So like the first one that came to mind in blue-white, Drannith Magistrate, a format warping card that basically says, hey, I am one of the most efficient low-to-the-ground stacks pieces. So like many times, if you have a Chrome Mox, a Mox Diamond, any sort of early acceleration, you have the ability to even just go Drannith into my commander, draw 2 cards, right? Very simple equation, but it does add up for a lot with a lot of these hands. Even things like Polywog Prodigy, right? You're definitely going to see some more unique creatures with higher toughness in these colors, but there's definitely some that are going to stick out as, oh yeah, we would definitely include cards like this, right? Soulless Jailer is another one. Great Azorius stacks piece, shutting down your opponent's graveyards, shutting down the ability for certain decks to cast things from exile, right? All of those things work really well. Here we have this ability. Hey, like let's shut some of these things down. Also, be a cantrip as soon as my commander comes out, right? Spellskate's another one I think totally illustrates this point, right? So we've got a sort of baseline of a couple of these creatures that definitely have a higher impact, right? So let's look at some of the win conditions, and then we'll kind of come back to more of the core essence of this deck, right? So some of the win conditions that you'll be a little bit more comfortable with that you might recognize from other cEDH decks. So the first of these would be the idea of Teferi Time Raveler plus Displacer Kitten. So, for example, with Teferi and Displacer Kitten and any of our mana rocks that are mana positive or mana neutral, we are able to have a loop where we are able to play our rock, right? Displacer Kitten will trigger and it will reset Teferi. So it's a new game object. Then you'll be able to use the -3 ability to put the rock back into your hand and draw a card with Teferi, right? So basically, the state of this loop is that we have created a situation where once again we'll be able to play the rock, it will reset to fairy, and the loop will be such that we are able to draw through our deck. Now, if in situations like this, right, for example, if I had my commander out, not only would I be able to draw through my deck, but each time I'm going through that loop, I'm also able to net a mana with Mox Amber, right? This works for Soul Ring, Mana Vault, Grim Monolith, many cards like that, and many more. Keeping this idea of mana neutral rocks in mind, we also have Hullbreaker Horror. So if we have Hullbreaker Horror and any two mana rocks, as long as one is neutral and one is gaining us mana, we have the ability to loop through our deck that way, right? And after we have generated infinite mana, we can then start bouncing our commander over and over again, replaying it and drawing two cards at a time. It has to be two, unfortunately, with this loop because we do have Hullbreaker Horror out and it does have a higher toughness than it does power. Now, I will say, in one of my early testing games with this deck, Hullbreaker did feel like it was more of a relevant win condition. Since that point, I actually have not won with Hullbreaker Horror in this deck. So it is one of those pieces that, at the end of the day, might just be a piece we don't need, right? It might just be an extra luxury piece that isn't exactly necessary in the deck, right? Because when we start to get towards some of the other combos that exist in this deck, some of the more nuanced and a little bit more complicated combos in the deck, that's the times in which you realize like there's so much layering leading up to the point where you would even think about having 7 mana that it goes like I don't even know if we need Hullbreaker in the deck. As of right now, I'm going to keep it just as a piece to have in case we need to go up to that part of the curve. But it is worth noting that I will say it's probably one of the more cuttable pieces in the deck right now. It's just nice to have the extra redundancy of win conditions. Now there are several more win conditions in the deck, and actually there's quite a handful. But to go into those win conditions, I feel like we should cover the rest of sort of the things that make the deck start to tick, because you'll start to realize a lot of the engines in the deck, a lot of the pieces that allow you to keep generating ridiculous amounts of card advantage are also then conversely able to convert into combo pieces, right? So for this deck, there's a little bit of that nuance to it where, as I said, there's some of these traditional win cons, which we've covered already, but there's also going to be some of these win cons that are highly, highly, highly layered on top of one another and require a bit of subtlety and a little bit of nuance to figure out exactly where they go. All right, so we have our commander, right? We have some of these high value cards that have greater toughness than power, right? So assuming we've resolved Plagon once, drawn 2 or 3 cards, maybe even 4 if we have a good opener, what do we do from there? Well, honestly, the best thing to do with this deck is be patient, right? This is a very classic blue white list. And this is one of the reasons I actually really like this deck, is because it does play really well into the metagame where you can often hold up a lot of mana so that if you are not needing to use your resources, you can then invest it into more flickers of Plagon, right? And that's kind of what we're indicating here, is that the strategy then becomes a bit more of a flicker strategy. Flickering meaning to exile a permanent and return it to the battlefield. So you will see things here like Felidar Guardian and Restoration Angel, which they all have enter the battlefield abilities that allow you to exile your commander and then return it to the battlefield. Luckily enough for us as well, they also have a higher toughness than power. Now, we mentioned the combo piece, Displacer Kitten, a little bit earlier in this deck tech for the combo section, but it's probably the best card in our deck. Now, Displacer Kitten allows you to basically convert any amount of instants, sorceries, and non creature spells, apart from those, into card draw, right? So even if you have Plagon, maybe an Ornithopter, and Displacer Kitten on the battlefield, suddenly every single time you're casting a spell, you're flickering Plagon, it's entering again, you're drawing another 2 cards, right? So as you can see, as you start to approach critical mass with this deck, as you start to have more things with higher toughness on the battlefield, as you start to be able to flicker more often, Displacer Kitten really does end up being the engine that converts value to a win towards the end of the game. We also have a subcategory in this deck of creatures that allow you to basically get multiple ETBs, right? Multiple enter the battlefield abilities. So the first of these will be Delny Streetwise Lookout. Now, these will also come in handy when we start to refer to the combo section of this deck a little bit later into the deck tech, as we refer to, once again, more of those layered wins, right? So Delny allows any creature with a power 2 or less to not be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater, but also it says if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less, vis-a-vis our commander, right, is the most important one there. To be triggered, it would trigger an additional time, right? So basically now our commander has 2 enter the battlefield. So if we flicker it or if we just cast it out of the command zone, it is entering twice, right? It also triggers for a lot of our other cards, right? So it's really high value in this deck. We get things like double Esper Sentinel, double Archivist of Agma, double Polywog Prodigy, right? These come up a great amount. So Delny is definitely a bit of a workhorse in this deck. It also gets double Displacer Kitten triggers and double Felidar Guardian triggers, which will come up as we come back later into this deck tech. Especially getting double of these has been insanely relevant. And fun fact, when you double Felidar Guardians after the battlefield ability, a lot of nonsense can happen. And that is one of the quickest ways you can actually convert Felidar Guardian into a win condition for sure. We also have Preston the Vanisher here with this deck. And honestly, I thought Preston was too cute for my original version of the deck until I added it in my more nuanced version that I got to later in this deck. You're going to hear a lot about me brewing this list. I think I spent something like 20 something hours on this deck of fine tuning it, adjusting it. There are multiple iterations that are just gone at this point because I did find the way that I have it currently to be the most optimal and the most consistent as I was goldfishing through the list. But yeah, this is definitely one of those decks where I gouged a lot out. I put a lot in. And I spent hours and hours and hours just trying to figure out the perfect configuration. And it's one of the reasons I'm so proud of this deck because I do think it was a successful experiment for sure. But Preston is a really interesting card, and it says whenever another non-token enters under your control, if it wasn't cast, create a copy of it that's an illusion. And then you can sack 5 illusions for 1 and a white to exile a non-land permanent, right? So every time that something is flickered in this deck, every time it's exiled and enters the battlefield, it is entering without being cast, right? So Preston would then make a 0/1 copy of it. So oftentimes, worst case scenario, when your commander comes in after being flickered, not from the command zone because you cast it at that point, right? But anytime your commander's flickered, now you're getting 2 enter the battlefield abilities from your commander because you're having this fake 0/1 copy die to state-based actions because they would both be legendary, but you're still getting the enter the battlefield ability, even though the fake copy of your commander is not there, right? This also comes up when we are doing things with Felidar Guardian and Restoration Angel, right? Because as soon as you start having those creatures actually flicker each other, right, you're suddenly getting copies of these cards, right? So I've even had scenarios too where I was able to, when things got a little bit crazy, have Displacer Kitten flicker itself, right? Which is kind of interesting because you reach this point with Preston and Displacer Kitten where you can start casting spells to make copies of Displacer Kitten, right? So now you have your Displacer Kitten and then like a 0/1 copy of your Displacer Kitten, and then you can do that again. So now suddenly all of your spells are flickering 3 different non-land permanents, including itself, which will then make another copy of it. Then you can start flickering your commander, which is also getting multiple enter the battlefield. Things get absolutely crazy when you set that engine up. So Preston is definitely one of those cards where every time you think you've seen the deck do something crazy with Preston, it does another cool, crazy thing with Preston. And if you're hearing a lot of this deck, it's a lot of setting these engines up, right? So it's the cards may not be super fantastic on their own, right? But when you have a bunch of resources in hand, when you're able to start building up a board state, when you start to build up a presence in this deck, it's when you get one piece plus the other piece and then fuse them together that they go from like, oh, acute synergy to, oh, this is broken fundamentally. I'm also so excited because for the longest time, I've wanted to play 5 mana Elish Norn. And this is finally the deck where I'm like, okay, we can actually play it here, right? So it's a Vigilant 4/7, says if a permanent entering causes a trigger ability of a permanent I control to trigger, it triggers an additional time. So everything we said about Delny happens here if it refers to something entering the battlefield, right? And once again, these do come up during combo turns as well. And then permanents entering the battlefield that don't cause the abilities of permanents your opponents control the trigger, which is also really sweet. So your opponents cannot have their Thassa's Oracle enter the battlefield. They cannot have their Tibbets enter the battlefield trigger. They lose Manglehorns and many ETBs that exist in this format. They just don't get those. No Search Off Ranger Captain, right? Like, so, there's not the most amount of ETBs in the format, right? Especially now that Dockside is gone. That is a little bit lessened, but still your opponent's not being able, especially in the blue-black and low-color blue-black decks, not being able to jam a Thassa's Oracle win out of nowhere is a very nice luxury to have. And then once again, this card is just gravy for the rest of your deck as well. Also, if you notice, 4 power, 7 toughness, it's another card draw for our commander, right? So even just Plagon and Elesh Norn alone is 2 triggers of draw 2 cards, right? This is where the deck starts to really snowball. Now, patient observers will notice one of the most important cards in this deck, and I can't believe I'm saying that unironically, Naru Meha, Master Wizard. So Naru Meha is so integral to what this deck is doing. It's really, really solid and one of our cleanest win conditions in the deck. Yeah. It is one of our cleanest win conditions with a lot of asterisks next to that description. There's going to be a lot of stuff that we go through as we go through this deck tech where it's going to start to make sense why Naru is so good. But let's go for the most simple wins with Naru and just move down to the instance to talk about it, right? So, for example, Blur is a very wild, common spell that I think would not really see play in most spaces, but specifically because this is a flicker effect, exile and then return, it does not delay. So it exiles and then returns immediately, right? And that is important to know. There are very few cards in this deck that exile and then return on end step. And if we do have those effects, they're so efficiently costed that it is worth it, right? The big one is Felia, which we'll cover a little bit later. But Blur exiles, returns, and draws a card, right? This and Ghostly Flicker are the cleanest combos with Narumeha specifically. With Blur, right, you're able to cast Blur on whatever creature you want to cast it on. In response, you cast your Narumeha. With the Enter the Battlefield ability, you make a copy of Blur, right? So unlike Dualcaster, you can make copies of Dualcaster and they stick around, right? With these effects, you can only do Enter the Battlefield in Flicker effects with Narumeha because it's a legend, right? So you can't make multiple copies of it, right? But what you can do is, for example, have something like Blur, where you make a copy with Narumeha and you're able to flicker Naru, it enters, you make another copy of Blur. But each time you're going through that, you're actually drawing a card, right? So this is a way to draw through your entire deck with Narumeha. We also have Ghostly Flicker in the deck, which allows you to exile up to 2 things in any combination of artifacts, creatures, or lands, right? So with Naru and a land, right, you're able to make infinite copies and just generate infinite mana, right? And then after you've generated infinite mana, you could potentially switch to your commander on the battlefield and start drawing through chunks of your deck, multiple chunks at a time, right? That's a really interesting way to go through it and in a pretty simple way to do it as well. Now, if you don't have your commander out, it gets a little more complicated because you have to find a way to like flash in your commander in response if that's something you need to be able to do, right? But in general, Ghostly Flicker plus your commander. Your commander's on the battlefield a lot in this deck, right? Like you want it to be there. So in case you have any of these incidental flicker effects, you're able to do that very effectively, right? Big shout out to one of our sponsors today, Heavy Play. Heavy Play is an awesome partner of the channel for some time. I love working with Heavy Play. And you can get 10% off your order by using code Comedian to grab these deck boxes, dice trays, really sick curved sleeves, any of those products. Check it out at heavyplay.com/comedian. They're also having a Black Friday sale coming up, so make sure to be paying attention. Heavyplay.com, easiest way to find any of those things. And once again, use code Comedian to get 10% off your order. Check it out. So clearly these instants that flicker are very important to the deck, which brings us to some of these instants that are like even more important, right? Which is our 1 mana instance. Now, these are the engine that gets this deck moving, right? These are the things that allow you to go, okay, cool. I'm going to play Plagon and pass the turn with like a mana up. And you can be doing that and hold up your Flusterstorms. You can hold up your Silences, your Path to Exiles, your normal interaction in cEDH, right? But you can also be holding up something like a Cloud Shift, right? So you have a lot of these situations where it's either A, I'm being a very responsible player, holding up a direction for the table, and then, hey, if nobody asks me to do anything, if nobody's presenting a super crazy threat, at the end step, I'll just Cloud Shift my commander, draw 3 cards. One instant for 3 cards. Seems great to me, right? Suddenly you're doing little ancestral recalls at your end step, right? Which I know it sounds a little crazier than it is. There's a lot of times in this deck where you can have up to 15 cards in hand and still probably not be able to present a win, which is a bit of a flaw, but you also get to the point where you have a ridiculous amount of cards in hand pretty easily, right? Like that is, it's a pretty easy function of this list to just be able to go like, all right, cool, end step, I'll Cloud Shift and then I'll Essence Flux, and okay, now I'm up to 12 cards and I'm going to go into my turn and untap, right? It's pretty easy to find yourself in that scenario with this list. So the important ones we do have are Cloud Shift, as I mentioned, Essence Flux, Ephemerate, and Ephemerate's even better because it has Rebound, right? So you exile and return your commander, draws a couple cards. Then on your upkeep, you have a chance to exile your commander again, draw even more cards. Awesome if you get that to happen. We have Momentary Blink, which is a 2-mana version, but it does give you a flashback option. So basically any amount of these effects under 3 mana look really good. I think the 1 mana ones are the auto includes by far. The 2 mana ones I don't feel fantastic about. As I mentioned, Momentary Blinks in there because it has flashback. And if you really get desperate, 2 instances of the blink is fine. There's a couple other 1 in a blue or 1 in a white exile and return effects with almost no upside. And so I've avoided those in the deck for now, but they're definitely like in the consideration at the very least, right? There's a lot of those effects that have been printed into limited formats that are just exile and return, but they don't really have another upside, right? They're not like Ghostly Flicker where they target 2 things, or Blur where they draw you an extra card, right? Each specifically chosen instant flicker effect has a very specific role in this list. So I shouted Felia out. I might as well bring up her in this conversation here. Let's talk about Felia. So she's a creature that basically allows you to flash her in, and then when you go to combat, you can exile a creature and then return it to the battlefield, right? So most often with Felia, I'm using her in the early game when I have Plagon and Felia, and hopefully 1 or 2 other creatures that I can get extra draws on, right? But the idea is that every turn you're getting a Plagon trigger. And Felia is one of the best pieces to help you in that early part of the game where you're really trying to grind out and get as much card advantage as you can to start to try and overwhelm your opponents with your card advantage in this deck, right? Felia is really solid for that purpose. And that's kind of why it makes it the exception to the rule of we don't like cards that exile and return on end step. Because she's so consistent, it's kind of worth it. One of the cards I was considering was Soul Herder, a very classic card in this respect, which is 1 blue white, and it exiles something and returns it on end step and then gets a counter for every time you do that. That card's also been a very heavy consideration in this deck, and I could easily see somebody playing it as well. The only thing is I've chosen to avoid Soul Herder because it starts as a 1/1, and I really don't want to invest 3 mana into something only to have it pinged by a Bowmaster and then have no value off of it whatsoever. It feels pretty bad, right? So that's why I've avoided that particular option. I think right now I'm going to go through each card type and sort of bring up any other highlights or any things that you might not see in a standard cEDH deck that are relevant here, right? So, for example, our 0 drops, I think they're uncuttable in this deck. They allow you to have a stronger Plagon cantrip in the beginning, and you might think to yourself, okay, but they just replace yourself when your commander enters. They replace themselves the first time, right? But every time you're now flickering your commander, and especially when you're going off during your storm turns, right? If you have things that you are casting and getting multiple iterations of flickering your commander, these you can draw, play for free, and then suddenly now when you're flickering your commander, you're getting extra draws as you go through that process. So I would have a really hard time cutting a lot of these 0 drops. Giver of Runes was cute. It has more toughness than power. It's one of the only impactful 1 drops that has higher toughness than power. There are other 1 drops that do exist, don't get me wrong, but they're pretty just okay. Like, I'm not really impressed by them. So Giver definitely earned its spot, in my opinion, for this list. I mean, some of the obvious ones I'm going to skip in this deck, like obvious, like Esper and Archivist, they're card draw. We love that, right? The clones. We will come back to the clones in this deck because they're good. They're high value pieces. You can copy a Thrasios, which then allows you to draw more cards, right? All of that stuff is super sweet. Clones are just good in general, and especially in a deck like this that has a lot of flickering in it. They also have combo implications, which I'll come back to. Ornithopter Paradise. Just, it's an arcane signet that has more toughness than power. It is a cantripping arcane signet. We're already on the mana rocks that I wanted to play anyways, and I was trying to figure out, and especially there was a lot of time where I was spending working on, is this a 29 land deck? Is this a 28 land deck? I ended up on 28 lands, and one of the things that convinced me was, okay, I'll play Ornithopter of Paradise as an additional mana rock that also helps advance my game plan a little bit forward. I'm not super sold on this one, but it does the job it needs to. Wrath Weatherlight Stalwart. It's actually really cool in this deck. I didn't think about it too hard until it was actually the last day before I sleeved up this list, and I was really excited to play it because when you're going through your storm turns, there's actually a lot of times where, I mean, this deck is not a combat based deck, right? Like you have a lot of creatures that have 0 power, 1 power, 2 power at most. So you're not exactly going into combat a lot of the time. So now I'm kind of figuring, as the game starts to get grindier, as you get into more of these control fests, as these counterspell fights get better, for every 2 creatures you have in this, I believe 28 creature deck, 28 creature deck, not including your commander, right? You just have the ability to, even if it's 1 or 2 spells a turn, right? If you have 2 to 4 creatures, being able to cast a Flusterstorm and then tap 2 creatures to draw a card, it comes up. I like legitimately think Wrath is a little bit slept on, but it feels like, especially in this deck, it just makes a lot of sense, right? I might be too excited about how well it works in here and apply it elsewhere, right? But in this deck, it does feel really solid at just being a good piece, right? Like it feels like a generic value engine, and that's okay. Like for one blue, 1 white, getting a generic value engine that also adds another creature to the board for when you're flickering your commander, perfectly designed for this deck. Scheming Fence is one I'm really excited about. I've been able to play it once in testing realistically, so it didn't show up during the tournament, sadly enough. But in a metagame right now where Kinnins are running around, Thrasioses are running around, Sisseys are running around, um, the ability to name mana rocks and shut those off, right? Scheming Fence is really cool. Like there's a lot of times where, and it is important to note, I did get this clarified, that if you name a non-land card with Scheming Fence, it does not shut off like a Pithing Needle all of the cards that fit under that category, right? You have to choose a thing, right? So if you say, I'm going to choose that Soul Ring there to shut off with Scheming Fence and gain its ability, you don't get to shut off every soul ring for the rest of the game. You just shut off that one soul ring, right? So that's a bit of clarification, but still, I mean, being able to go, okay, cool, I'm going to play this 2 mana creature. I'm going to shut off your Thrasios, and now I have a Thrasios on my side of the field. That's also a higher toughness creature for my commander, right? Or, even just being like, I'm going to shut off your soul ring, and now this 2 mana creature taps for 2 mana. I'm going to shut off your 1 ring, right? That's a really big one that this gets to be able to copy as well, right? And just you get the activated ability with, also you don't have the trigger to lose life at the beginning. So if you shut down someone else's 1 ring with Scheming Fence, it's very, very good for you. Soulless Jailer we talked about earlier. Same thing with Spellskate. I mean, Spellskate's just a great card. This is Callahan, my co-host from the Mind Sculptors, and I were joking around that this is the last bastion for Final Word Phantom. We have so many amazing flash effects that exist in this format right now. Final Word Phantom is definitely one of them. It's not the best, but in this deck, once again, higher toughness than power, and it fits into this play style for this list a little bit more, right? We are not trying to often save up a bunch of mana to multiple win attempts on top of other people's win attempts. It's just not really how this deck functions. So in that sense, Final Word Phantom, it just gets the job done while also, once again, advancing your own game plan by giving you more things for your commander to draw off of. Another one that I saw 0 of during the tournament, so can't really say either way. All right, these guys we've talked about. Phyrexian Metamorph said we'll talk about clones later. Restoration Angel, super important to the deck. Another enter the battlefield ETBer. It having flash comes up so much. I love the ability to go, cool, I'm going to pass with 4 mana up and hold up all this interaction, or more mana, right? And then end step, worst case scenario, cool, enters, flicker Plagon. Worst case scenario, if you just have Plagon Resto, it's 2 cards. Super happy with that exchange. Would do it 90% of the time. We're trying the Witch Enchanter as an MDFC, right? Every time I tell people all the time when I have MDFCs in my decks, they are there because they are lands, and sometimes they are more than lands. And also, with the amount of flicker effects in this deck, with the amount of doubling enter the battlefield abilities in this deck, I can easily see Witch Enchanter coming in and just ruining a bunch of Rhystic Studies and Mystic Remoras and et cetera, right? So yeah, super fine with that inclusion. We have one sorcery in this deck, and it's Ponder. And I can't stress enough how much you need Ponder in this deck. The early game with this list can be volatile, right? When you get your engine online, the deck feels super smooth and it operates really, really well. With opening hands, a lot of the time, because I mentioned before how there's not a lot of good one drops for this deck, apart from like Esper and the Giver of Runes, right? So Ponder's kind of there to fix the first turn of the game, right? It's just a nice little cantrip. It comes up at times. A lot of the time during your storm turns, it's basically free, right? Because you're trying to go off the kitten or something like that. So at the end of the day, Ponder does what it needs to. That's really all I could ever ask of it. um, but one thing that's more important here in the sorceries is you'll notice I don't play a lot of tutors. And you're going to see that as we start to move through the instance too, there are very few tutors in this deck because they just don't need to be there, right? And also the tutors in blue white are mostly for artifacts, for enchantments, right? They're not for pieces that are actually the things we care about in this deck. I was messing around with Mystical Tutor a little bit just to be able to, get my Ghostly Flicker or my Blur or my Cloud Shift or my Ephemerate. And what I was finding was that I was just in a situation a lot of the times in this deck where I didn't want to give up the draw step and I'd rather just draw more raw cards, right? That might be wrong. I'm willing to accept that potentially is just a greedy mentality for this deck, but in general, I wasn't really excited about the idea of top decking more instants and giving up a draw to do so. I was more excited about the idea of just hitting the raw draw and making it work. And a lot of the times with this deck, I found the proof of concept to check, right? It was working for that purpose. It's a pretty traditional interaction suite here with the instance. The thing you might notice is there's no Pact of Negation. I debated on Pact a lot in this deck. I really, really did. I ended up going with a couple other different types of free spells with Submerge, which did perform very well. No complaints here. And Misdirection, which never came up. It was one of my last minute additions. I believe in it a lot because, as I mentioned many times with this deck, you're passing with like 7 or 8 cards in hand, right? Obviously, going down to hand size. But you do pass with a lot of cards and you do have the ability to draw a bunch of cards at instant speed. So having more free interaction, I'm a big fan of. The thing with Pact, and the reason why I chose Misdirection over Pact for this deck was this is a grindy deck. This is much more of a mid-range deck, right? So Pact is much better in decks where you're trying to aggressively jam your win condition and have something to back that up, right? Whereas this deck is much more of the I would like to play the responsible game plan. I want to interact at the right times. I want to find my windows. And I don't want to be stuck in situations where I have to use a Pact and then go to my turn and pay 5 mana in a deck where every mana counts. And I can't stress that enough in this archetype. Every mana counts. And you'll see that when we go into the artifacts with a very particular inclusion here with this list. But yeah, so that's the reason for no Pact. I even felt bad about it. There were times in this tournament where, if you watch my summary that's going to be on the Mind Sculptors next week, I'll tell about a couple times where I just drew a bunch of cards and 0 interaction, even though this deck is, I would argue, pretty interactive, right? We're looking at, 23 instants here, 4 of them being instants that like are 4, actually a decent amount that are flicker based instants, right? But that's that's kind of the idea there, right? But point being, there are times where not having Pact did come up, and I definitely will be thinking about that as we go through. And for the mana choke scenario, I do think Cyclonic Rift is definitely a little bit interesting in this deck. I do like to pass with mana up in this list, but 7 mana is still a lot in a deck that does struggle with mana production. That's the thing with this deck is like mana is pretty hungry to the point where I was talking with other people who were playing at the tournament and they were mentioning Monologue Tax, which is not a card I've ever considered playing. But, given the fact that this deck, as I mentioned, is very mana hungry, might not be the worst thing in the world. Moving down to artifacts, there's a few really to point out. Now, there's acceleration pieces in here that may be appealing to some people, may not be appealing to some people. I will die on the hill that Jeweled Amulet is perfect for this deck. We talked about how having those consistent turn ones with this deck, leads you to play things like Ponder. Jeweled Amulet is upsettingly very good. For those who haven't seen it, it's basically a weird mana rock where On one turn, you can charge a mana into it. So, for example, if you have like an island and a jeweled amulet, you charge a blue mana into it, and then on a later turn, you can tap it to remove that charge and make a mana of that type. It's not an attractive mana rock, but it gets the job done. And there are many times where I would not have been able to curve out efficiently without Jeweled Amulet. So, throwing it out there, the card's better than it looks. So Grafdigger's Cage deck, super happy with the Grafdigger's inclusion. We do not really care about the graveyard that much. And yeah, stopping your opponent's breach lines and all of those things is super, super important in the current metagame. We're also in a Kinnan and Sisay meta. And yeah, those things not happening is a-okay with me. And shutting down the other green decks at the table, all big plus benefits. So here we have, unironically, one of the most important pieces in this deck. This is a huge, huge piece because I messed around with this deck, as I mentioned, for hours and hours and hours, and no one card opens up more combo potential than Altar of the Brood. This is not a joke. This is not ironic. Like, this is 100%. Altar of the Brood adds probably a dozen different combos into this deck that did not exist pre-inclusion. What do I mean? And why am I talking like a crazy person? With Altar of the Brood on the battlefield, suddenly, Narumeha, which we talked about only comboing with specific pieces earlier in this episode, suddenly that combos with every single flicker effect in your deck, right? Now suddenly I can go to Cloud Shift my commander, in response, hold priority, flash out the Narumeha. Once again, it doesn't have to be the commander, but any creature, right? And suddenly Naru enters, everyone mills one. The Naru targets the Cloud Shift, makes a copy, flickers, Naru comes back in, targets Cloud Shift, everybody mills one. Suddenly everybody is milling their entire libraries, right? So once again, Soulless Jailer, Grafdigger's Cage, preventing any sort of graveyard shenanigans. There's a lot of ways you can actually stop your opponents from, instant speed breaching and stuff like that. With this deck, you can play Teferi, all of that stuff. But the point being, suddenly all of your flicker effects and Narumeha are a combo with Altar of the Brood on the battlefield. Let's look up here at the creatures as well. Felidar Guardian and Restoration Angel, they enter and flicker. So now all of a sudden, Restoration Angel and Felidar Guardian become a combo because they enter, flicker one, enters, flicker the other, and they just go back and forth infinitely, which normally wouldn't do anything. But with an Altar of the Brood, it mills your opponents out of their deck. Now, Restoration Angel is unfortunate because it says when it enters, you may exile a non-angel creature. So a clone does not make infinite enter the battlefields with Restoration Angel. Felidar Guardian, on the other hand, does not have that restriction. So, for example, with Phyrexian Metamorph or the Flesh Duplicate that we talked about earlier, now all of a sudden, you can play a Flesh Duplicate as a copy of Felidar Guardian, and they flicker each other back and forth. And with Altar of the Brood, mill your opponents out, right? So there are a lot of ways to convert things entering the battlefield to now we are actually exiling everything, right? There's a lot of ways to trigger that process, and Altar of the Brood is just so good because, as I mentioned, all these cards that like could do infinite flickers and not go anywhere suddenly are wins, right? You're able to just mill out every single one of your opponents, which is obviously insanely powerful with this deck, right? So especially when you're navigating like a tight storm line, a lot of the times Altar is like a really good thing to like get you Displacer Kitten triggers and stuff like that. And the ability to just go, okay, the first set of flicker infinitely I hit, suddenly that's a win con. It comes up all the time with this deck, and it's very, very relevant. I would not play this deck without Altar of the Brood at this point. I have looked for other versions of this effect too. They do not really exist. There's no effect that really does anything like this. I would love like a damage version of this effect. It really isn't there. Relic of Legends. Another card I would file under the uncuttable category in this deck. Now, you may look up at the creatures and say, like, okay, there's a couple legends in here, right? We have Naru, we have Elishnorn, we got Preston, we have Raph, and we have our commander, right? So, like, that's not the craziest amount of legends. Was like 6 or 7? Oh, and Delny, too, I should mention. The thing is, this is a flicker deck, right? And Relic of Legends taps the creature. The creatures do not have to have summoning sickness removed, right? So Because it's an activated ability of Relic of Legends, anytime your creatures come in, they can be tapped for mana, your legends specifically. So when you're comboing off with Plagon, all of a sudden, every time you flicker your commander and draw a bunch of cards, your commander is also able to then tap for mana. So, for example, when you have Displacer Kitten, your commander in Relic of Legends, suddenly every single 1 mana spell is a free spell that also draws you cards. That's where things start to get really insane with this deck. Every 0 mana spell is netting you mana as you go through the loop, right? So now these pieces are tapping for mana, and as you're, even if you're just doing the normal flicker thing, you're able to flicker your commander, draw a bunch of cards, and then still have mana untapped to be able to interact, right? Relic comes up a ton. It's very powerful in this deck. I would not cut it for anything. It is one of the ironclad, solid, uncuttable pieces in here, and it makes your storm turns infinitely easier. It makes, your interactive counterspell fights infinitely easier. Cannot recommend Relic of Legends enough in this deck. It is a perfect mana rock. Want to thank one of our sponsors for this episode, toamagic.com. If you want great singles, if you want a great price on those singles, check out toamagic.com and use code comedian to get 5% off your order. There is also live pickup, so if you're heading to things like SCGs, big events like that, RCQs, MagicCon, any of those things, you can order on Toamagic and pick it up at location. So check out toamagic.com. You'll see it in the description below, and use code comedian for 5% off your order. Moving on. Smothering Tithe, amazing in this deck. I mentioned we get choked on mana a lot. Fantastic. Touch the Spirit Realm. We all know Touch the Spirit Realm at this point in the format. It just has a little bit of extra benefit in here because, at some point, if you're flooding out a little bit too much or you already have a bunch of interaction, you can go, cool, let me just exile my commander, bring it back at the end step. Worth to note, you do bring back at the end step with this effect. So this is the other of the 2 effects in this deck that bring back on end step. So when you do it on your opponent's turns, make sure to exile it in their second main phase so it comes back on end step, so you don't accidentally exile your commander for your turn if you try to do it on the last person's end step. That'd be a little bit awkward. And then the final piece to highlight is Blind Obedience. This is our second hard win condition in this deck. So our first one being milling our opponents, right? Fully milling them out with the Altar of the Broodlines passing and letting them draw no cards, right? But there are going to be times where we need to be able to actually kill our opponents, especially when you run out of time in a match, right? When you hit minute 0, you want to be able to actually kill your opponents. Importantly, Blind Obedience has the ability Extort, which means every time you cast a spell, you can pay white or black to drain them of 1 life, and you gain the life equal to life lost this way, right? So when you have things like, for example, and this is one of the reasons to me that we kind of have to keep Hullbreaker Horror, is it is one of the easiest ways to explain going and casting infinite spells into Blind Obedience, right? So, for example, the Hullbreaker Horror loop that we talked about earlier, now all of a sudden you can bounce those rocks infinitely back and forth, and as long as you are netting infinite mana, which you should be by that loop, and netting infinite white mana, you can now start extorting the spells every time you cast them with Blind Obedience, which will drain your opponents of life. Importantly, this also gets around the One Ring, so you can win through One Ring protection also during the same turn that you go to win the game, right? So all of these are very relevant factors for this deck. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of ways that you can pass with Altar of the Brood and make sure your opponents can't win at instant speed with shenanigans, but still, it's nice to have a win condition that just says, this is ending, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, they're just dead. So we've already talked about a lot of the ways the deck can win, right? Especially when we introduce some of these more specific pieces that we've gone into significant detail about. Now here comes the part of the deck that becomes really interesting, which is the decision trees and the 3 to 4 card combos in the deck, right? So for every one of the straightforward combos that I mentioned earlier in this deck tech, there's about 100 random this plus this plus this is actually infinite combos in this deck. For example, any of our enter the battlefield doublers, right? So Elish Norn or Delny, right? With Felidar Guardian and Restoration Angel, suddenly transitions that from, oh, hey, we're blinking everything, right? You can have that blink your commander infinitely, but also Felidar Guardian says permanent, right? So if you have those two and an enter the battlefield doubler, Now all of a sudden you're able to actually generate infinite mana as well, right? Because you're able to blink a land every time you are executing that loop back and forth. And you have infinite blinks of any creature on the battlefield, which is also super valuable in this deck. Even things like Narumeha, right? I mentioned how there's situations where you can copy a 1 mana instant over and over again, right? And go infinite with Alter the Brood. But fun fact, you can also do that with Narumeha and maybe not mill everybody out. But if you have Relic of Legends, you can actually generate infinite mana with this deck, right? So with a thing like Cloud Shift on the stack, you can have Naru come in, enters, you tap it for a blue or a white with the ability on the stack, and then have the enter copy the flicker. And then Naru comes back. And now suddenly it's an untapped Naru. And yeah, once again, without alter, you're not milling anybody out, but every time you're resetting to an untapped Narumeha, which can then tap to Relic of Legends to generate a mana, right? So now all of a sudden, 5 mana with Relic of Legends out goes instead, this is infinite mana, infinite blue white. And with a lot of decks, you can usually figure out a way to win with infinite mana. The same can be said for Felidar Guardian, any of the enter the battlefield doublers, and the clone effects, right? So, for example, if you're doing the infinite Felidar and Phyrexian Metamorph thing, you're able to flicker permanents, flicker any ETBs, reset your commander, etc., right? So there's a lot of ways, once again, to actually start going infinite with these. Preston the Vanisher is also a big piece for these, right? Because as you're going through these loops, especially with things like Felidar Guardian and Restoration Angel, once again, as that classic example, every time you're flickering each other, you're then making the 0/1 copies of these creatures, which are then able to flicker a creature or flicker a land or flicker any of your permanents, right? Depending on which one you're going infinite with, right? So suddenly Preston then opens up a lot of situations where you're making infinite 0/1s, right? Important to not cast your commander if you do make infinite 0/1s, because then you will have to draw through your entire deck. So don't do that. But that is something to note with this deck too, right? So there's a lot of infinite possibilities with these cards, right? So a lot of them layer really tightly on top of one another, and it's really important to note. There's even situations where actually Preston plus Naru, which is a line I am discovering as we speak during this recording, Preston plus Naru plus any flicker gives you infinite flickers of anything, right? So, for example, you have your commander out, you go to Cloud Shift your commander, you have Preston and Narumeha there, you have Naru come in, it'll target the Cloud Shift, but then Preston will see a fake Narumeha and make a fake one because Naru will be flickering itself, which will make a 0/1 that will die to state-based actions because it's legend, but you'll have an extra ability to copy Cloud Shift and then target your commander or any of your creatures, right? So there's so many ways that this deck just layers on top of layers on top of layers on top of layers that many of these pieces combo with like 8 or 9 other cards, right? So this deck definitely rewards ingenuity from the pilot, where if you can pay attention and go, okay, what happens if I flicker this? Does this combo into this, right? There's definitely certain pieces in the deck like Narumeha, Preston, Felidar Guardian. A lot of those pieces you're going to hear me say a lot because they do happen to come up a lot when we're referring to these combos, right? So those are the pieces that I would definitely be looking out for when you're piloting this deck, because you may not realize that you just have an infinite mana or infinite card draw or infinite flicker thing on the board. It's just a little complicated to get there. So we've talked a little bit about this deck, how to win with it, etc. Now the final thing to talk about is like, what do you do with an opening hand, right? And we'll go through a couple example mulligans here. I'll walk you through the thought process and we can go from there. Now, this opener here is already kind of a banger. We have the ability to, while we don't have a lot of things to trigger Plagon, we do have a lot of acceleration and a way to get multiple enter the battlefield abilities from Plagon and Displacer Kitten here. So in this situation, I'm looking to dump all my mana turn 1, the Ancient Tomb into the Talisman into the Mana Vault. And then from there, I'm going to hope to draw either some creatures with higher toughness than power, or potentially more non-creature spells so that I am able to get more into the battlefield abilities from my commander. I forgot to mention earlier too, the clones in this deck also can be ways to reset your commander, because there are times when things go very wrong where your commander can be stuck on the battlefield, right? And so a flesh duplicate can come in as a copy of Plagon. You can let your real Plagon die due to state-based actions, put it back in the command zone, get an ETB from flesh duplicate, and then have the ability to recast your commander the following turn. So that does come up, but it's more of a desperation move than anything else. Now here we can also, hopefully get double displacer kit and things, but that doesn't always quite work the way you want it to. And an important note about this deck, when you flicker a game object, it is no longer the thing that you might have targeted previously, right? So, for example, if we have Displacer Kitten and Flesh Duplicate with our commander on the battlefield, right? We go to cast this Mana Vault. You cannot have two Displacer Kittens targeting Plagon and have that work. You can do that, it would just be bad. Because what's going to happen is Plagon will be flickered by the first Displacer Kitten, right? And then the second Displacer Kitten would go, well, the thing that you originally targeted is no longer here. This is a new Plagon. It's different from the Plagon that was once on this battlefield, right? For the same reason that you can flicker something to dodge removal, it's also the same reason you cannot flicker the same thing twice when abilities are put in the stack at the same time, right? So, for example, there are many times when I'm comboing with Displacer Kitten where I have an effect like Cloud Shift or Essence Flux, one of the classic flickers of the deck, where instead of trying to flicker my commander with Displacer Kitten's ability, I'll use the spell to flicker Plagon and then have the Displacer Kitten flicker the rocks and things like that. Just a fun little note for anyone wondering about the rules part of that. All right, on to a new hand that isn't maybe as busted as this one. Ooh, I love talking about hands like this. So in certain pods, this hand is a snap keep. And honestly, in a lot of pods, I can see this hand putting in a lot of work. A Graph Digger's Cage plus 2 0-mana spells turn 1 makes me feel pretty solid. Graph Digger's Cage is an amazing stacks piece, and I'm never really going to be upset about having it on turn 1. The Ornithopter and Phyrexian Walker are awesome. Once again, for our first Plagon cast, it already coming down and drawing 3 cards is going to be great, right? So that's pretty sweet. The fact that we also have Scheming Fence to follow up the Graph Digger's Cage and potentially, once again, snipe a Soul Ring, snipe a Mana Vault, something like that, that then allows us to have a bunch of mana to play our commander later on. All of that's gravy. These have actually been some really nice openers. It is important to note that this hand doesn't always have these, or this deck doesn't always have these bangers of hands, right? Like there are times where you will multi-5 and you'll definitely recognize that you're playing an Azorius deck. This is honestly another keep. I'm like actually kind of blown away at how many keepable hands we're getting in a row here, right? This is a turn 1 ability to fetch a Tundra, play Soul Ring, play Spellskite and Shield Sphere. Next turn, get Plagon, draw 3 cards. Plus, we have Cloud Shift if we hit a land drop, or the ability to play Giver of Runes too. This is actually all gas. Yeah, I wish I was drawn like this during the tournament. This would be sweet. There were some great hands I have with this deck, but definitely not always hands like this. This is awesome. Yeah, you keep these every day for sure. This one's not bad. It's like fine and probably keepable in a tournament setting. It's a turn 1 Soul Ring into a turn 2 Relic of Legends /out Archivist of Agama. Now, the Plagon plan isn't super amazing in this hand, but we're also 1 flicker away from generating infinite mana. Not that we have a way to win with it right now, but it's important to note that that is something very close to this opener. And the fact that you have one of your card draw engines plus a lot of acceleration in the first 2 turns specifically, seems great. Once again, the hands don't always look like this. This is like we're running really hot right now on Moxfield. Also, to just so anyone knows, the Moxfield playtester is an amazing resource that I use so often. When I was building this deck, I unironically think I went through 1,000 mulligans, if not more, on this playtester to get myself comfortable playing this list. So, cannot recommend using this resource enough. Finally, we have a hand 2 that I'm not willing to keep. This is very slow. We don't do anything turn 1. Turn 2, we can play a Dauntless Dismantler, which I don't hate. But turn 3, we're looking at some of our cute value creatures, and like they're great for later combo turns. But I'm really not trying to go off with a hand like this. It's going to take a while before it's impactful, and especially if we're in like 3rd or 4th seed, it's not really going to have as much advantage as I would like it to have. I mean, almost every time I see land Soul Ring Spellskite turn 1 plus additional stuff turn 2, it's like almost always a keep with this deck. Yeah, it's really hard to say no to that. Plus Polywog as a backup. Um, Unfortunately, the curving with Polywog is a little awkward here because you almost always want to go Polywog first, then Spellskite second. Funny enough, and the awkwardness is your commander does not level up Polywog, but you have enough creatures in this deck that absolutely do. So it's super worth playing. Um, but all of that being said, yeah, still turn one Soul Ring into a Spellskite is still gas. You have a bunch of stuff you can do turn two. I once again kind of zero complaints. These hands have been awesome. This hand to me is a turn two Rhystic Study, which is also totally fine. Turn one, you're gonna upkeep Enlightened Tutor. Go grab a Rhystic Study. You have to play the Dark Our Waste. So I mean you're gonna take 4 damage in total to get a turn two Rhystic Study down, but I mean you're then gonna get a turn two Rhystic Study down. So okay, this is an interesting one. Gemstone Cavern sort of limits us on mana. This is a hand that takes a lot of gambles, and you have a 5 and a 7 drop stuck in there, and you have to exile a card just to even play this hand. Pretty bad. Second 7 here, we're looking at. I normally don't like the Surveil Lands in this deck because sometimes you have awkward turn ones. I am on Meticulous Archive, and it has helped, especially in situations where I get stuck where they've like countered all of my flicker effects and I have Plagon stuck on the battlefield. Meticulous helps me dig a little bit, or if I get flooded hard. Um, but looking at this situation here, we can play the Jeweled Amulet, charge it turn one. We can even just play the Jeweled Amulet and not charge it. Go for that turn two Soulless Jailer with the potential for the turn three Plagon. Seems totally okay with me. It's a little bit of a slower hand, and I think this would be a little bit pod dependent, right? But it does have pieces that get the deck moving, and I don't hate it by any means. I think it's just, as I mentioned, one of the slower hands that is like close to acceptable in this deck. I think if you're in a pod with a Rogsai or a Keurig or a Godo or an Atali, right, you don't keep a hand like this one. Well, actually, with Atali you do because you have turn two Soulless Jailer. But any of the other things that I just mentioned, that's a little bit worse. So in that case, I think we're just gonna kind of say no. Although actually against Keurig too, this is anti-reanimator tech as well. So actually, I think half of the graveyard decks that I just mentioned, the fast decks that I mentioned, you keep against. Half of them you don't. All right, and final hand we'll look at. Turn one Phyrexian Walker with the ability to play a turn two Plagon to draw 2 cards, or a turn two Relic of Legend. The issue here is that if we're going to play that Chrome Mox and get the maximum value off of it, we either have to top deck a good card or we have to throw away a Ranger Captain, which is not a card I like to throw away at all. We do have Urza Saga here, which can eventually get us a Grafdigger's Cage, but it can also get us our Alter the Brood, which is a win condition, which I don't hate here. You can also just use it to grab Acceleration, grabbing a Soul Ring later down the line. This hand is maybe a little bit okay in a slower pod, but I wouldn't be really excited about this. Also, a quick note about Ranger Captain while we're here. I have at many points in this deck played Ranger Captain and then grabbed one of my 0 drops. Like Ranger Captain for Shield Sphere has actually been a play line that I have gone for because, once again, the more redundancy you have on these early cheap creatures, the more Plagon draws every time it enters, and then the more flicker effects you play, the stronger Plagon gets. So, while traditionally something like an Esper Sentinel will, on average, draw more cards, if you know you're going to be flickering Plagon a decent amount in the upcoming turns, it's often more worth it to grab some of these early creatures because they are free, and suddenly that's just one extra card draw per flicker effect, right? So this has been my deck tech for Plagon, Lord of the Beach. I love this deck. It is definitely on my roster of decks I will be playing for who knows how long. It's really awesome to play. It hybridizes like a very controlling mid-range deck with a really fun storm payoff when you go to combo. It really pays off for knowing your deck well. It pays off for being creative and coming up with lines that maybe not traditionally associated with combo lines in the deck. There's a lot of 3, 4, 5 card combos in the list that sort of just fall into place on one another. And it's so fun to come up with these lines on the spot to test yourself as a pilot and to really do a lot of problem solving to get yourself to this place. Right now, I will not recommend this deck for players who are uncomfortable in storming type scenarios because this is a deck that does require that type of gameplay. Right, I've had situations come up where had I not cast the right non-creature at the right time after playing a Delny to double my Displacer Kitten trigger, I would have had exactly 1 mana short to be able to go for a combo. Right, those things do come up with this deck. On the other hand, this is also a deck where I have won the game and sent a picture to my fiance with 60 cards in hand, and I said, I got this one, right? So like, it's an awesome deck, and it does a lot of crazy stuff. And also, like, perhaps the derpiest art to ever be on a CEDH commander. I love Plagon. I think this is the one of the most chaotic commanders of all time as far as design, and the fact that this is a CEDH playable little gremlin. I adore this deck. I love it. You play such weird cards. You play such unique cards that you don't play in any other cEDH list. And they're all cards that I have loved for a really long time. So Plagon definitely entering itself immediately into one of my top decks in all of cEDH. I love this deck. I will be playing it forever. It's so much fun. Yeah. Thank you all for watching this video. If you want help on bringing your competitive brew to the next level, if you want help taking that step up to become a cEDH player, if you want coaching in any capacity, reach out to me at comedianmtg@gmail.com is the easiest way to do that. You can also find me on places like Twitter and Blue Sky and Instagram, most of which are in the description down below this video. The email is the easiest one, comedianmtg@gmail.com. Come email me there. We're also looking to potentially do some holiday sales as we move towards the November, December time as we start to approach Black Friday. So definitely reach out about those, and I'll be posting on my Discord or any of my social medias any sort of sales that are happening once again as we move towards the holidays. So thank you all so much for joining me for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.